Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this month's video evidence training webinar. This month, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We've gotten a lot of requests during past months' webinars. At the end, we run a survey, and one of the most common requests was to go a little bit further into some of the tools in the video evidence toolbox. And so today, we've gotten Jimmy Schroering from DME Forensics on board to help co-present this webinar to show the forensic video analysis workflow from acquisition of DVR evidence all the way through to video processing and ultimately report writing. We'll be going through a case study for the largest duration of this webinar to dive into a real case and how these technologies can be used in conjunction with one another to get through an entire case in significantly expedited time. Jimmy Schroering is the CTO of DME Forensics, and I've got him on the line to further introduce himself here. So Jimmy, if you're there, I'm going to set you as presenter now. And if you wouldn't mind going into a little bit of your background, and then to dive in a little bit further into the old methods of how to extract video from DVRs, and then currently the methods that are now employed by video forensic examiners. So I'm going to set you as presenter now.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be pretty helpful to people out there watching. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jimmy Schroering. I started DME Forensics back in 2013. Prior to that, I'd been working in digital multimedia evidence since about 2003. I started at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation at the crime lab there, and was there for about 6 years, which really was during that time the kind of the transition that we saw from analog to digital video recording. So going from getting tapes to more often than not getting either whole DVRs or at least evidence from DVRs. After that, I worked at Target at their forensic services lab for a couple of years, and then went on to work at the forensic audio, video, and image analysis unit at Quantico for the FBI. That opportunity really gave me a chance to dive into DVRs and what we really could do with them. Obviously, there was just the basic recoveries, but there was also opportunities to recover video evidence from DVRs that people just thought was lost, that it wasn't going to be able to be recovered, whether it was deleted or whatever the case is. So what I'd like to talk about first here is how we did things kind of back in the day, if you will, and how that's kind of transitioned into what we can do now. Now, just like any other technology, this is kind of analogous to mobile devices, and we'll tackle that in just a minute here. But what are some of the biggest problems that you guys see when it comes to DVRs? Well, some of them are listed on this page, and some of these interfaces I think you guys will be familiar with if you've done recovery of data from DVRs. So identifying the password. If you don't have the password and you can't find a back door somewhere, you're really kind of stuck. You know, there's obviously the situation where the owner of the DVR is not willing or able to give up the password. If they're a suspect, they may not be willing to. Unfortunately, if they're the victim and they're deceased, they're not going to be able to. So getting access to the DVR in the first place is sometimes the hardest part. But once you're in, you have to navigate the interface and find how to recover footage. So on the right-hand side, I've got a picture of what we've kind of nicknamed the checkbox from hell DVR, where you can see the 6 different checkboxes, and basically you have to go page by page and select all the clips that you want. And if you wait too long, it'll reset back to the beginning, and it's just kind of a pain to deal with, especially if you want to export a large amount of video. Once you've figured out the interface, then you have to worry about slow export times. I mean, you're still dealing with USB 2 on the vast majority of these. So, and in addition, they're not very fast machines. So you're going to have situations where all you need is, an hour's worth of footage, but it could take you, even up to an hour just to get that footage off onto a USB thumb drive. Maybe even best case scenario, it might take you 15 or 20 minutes, depending on the DVR. Then once you have something out to USB, how do you play that back? Hopefully the DVR gave you a player, but as we all know, oftentimes that isn't the case. And without that player, it can be difficult to play those files back. Luckily, we have tools now that can assist with that, but back in the old days, this didn't exist. You were kind of stuck Googling until you could find a player. Heck, back then, I don't even think Google existed, but these days, at least you can Google. And then finally, ensuring the recovered footage is the best evidence. So you have a player, but how do you know for sure that what it's showing you is accurate? And we're going to touch on that a little bit later. So those are the times when you actually have the DVR and it can be useful to you. But there's also the times when you may have the DVR, or as in the picture on the left, you may have what's left of the DVR and you may not be able to use it. So if it's damaged or destroyed, that's not going to be much help to you. Device malfunctions, it may say that it's exporting USB, you pull the thumb drive out and there's nothing on the drive. Really common one, footage of interest has been deleted or quote unquote overwritten. You're interested in a certain date and time and you got there just a little bit too late and now the DVR says it's gone. How can you proceed? And in the old days, you really couldn't. There wasn't a lot you could do. And then I'm sure everybody in here, if you do any sort of work with DVRs, has been through this. Detective went out and seized just the hard drive. They left the DVR behind. And all you get is a hard drive. What are you supposed to do with that? And again, old days, there wasn't a lot you could do. But luckily now we have some options for that. So one thing I just wanted to point out is that it's kind of been, I wouldn't call it a myth, but going around quite a bit that all these DVRs are all completely different. And I would say that all the boxes are completely different. But the thing about it is when you actually get to the insides of them, which are the boards, they're not all different. And that's how we're able to attack some of this problem. If every system was different, the stuff we're about to show you today really wouldn't be possible or feasible. But we see so many systems that are on the inside very much the same, but on the outside look completely different. So the example I have here on the left-hand side, the 3 DVRs, those all function almost identically internally. Same thing with the 4 on the right. And so it all comes down to the board that's inside. And that's what we go after. So what we're looking for is how does that board read and write data to that hard drive? And then we can reverse engineer it and put that into software that allows you to be able to recover data without using the DVR at all. Enter Dvr Examiner. So Dvr Examiner, some of you may have heard of it. This is how we define what Dvr Examiner is. And I'm going to go over the first sentence in kind of detail because it's important, but the rest of it I'll leave up to you guys to read. But Dvr Examiner is a software solution for acquiring video and metadata from surveillance DVRs in a forensically sound manner. So keywords here, it's a software solution. We're not connecting to the DVR. All those problems that you had in the past with accessing the DVR for the password or slow export times, all that is because of the box. We don't want to connect to that because it reintroduces all those problems. So we are purely based on software. We'll talk about how we actually get connected here in a second. We're acquiring video and metadata. So not just getting a picture of the evidence, but we're actually getting the raw data and the metadata like dates and times and camera information and all that stuff that can be crucial in investigations. We're going to be able to get that as well. And then it's from surveillance DVRs. If you have a TiVo box at home, this is not for you. This is for CCTV or surveillance DVR systems. And then probably most importantly, in a forensically sound manner. So when you're accessing the data on a DVR and the DVR is still running, there is still the potential that that data is changed as it's still running. Or if you're close to the time when it might be overwritten, it could be potentially trying to overwrite some of the footage you're interested in while you're still accessing that system. What we're doing is allowing you to access it where that data is not being changed at all. And that really, it can be crucial down the line. So this is what the connection process looks like. You take the hard drive out of the DVR, and that causes some people some trepidation sometimes, but the reality is it's a really simple process to do, and you get the benefit of you're not going to be changing any of the evidence going forward. So we're going to be able to access that in a forensically sound manner. You connect it to a rights locker, If you're a computer forensic examiner, you probably have a stack of these at your office. But if you're not, they're not that expensive. But what they are designed to do is protect that hard drive. So no matter what Windows or the computer wants to do, it will never write back to that hard drive. And it's also a method in the case of a laptop that you can connect an internal hard drive to it. So you connect that to a computer, and then you can access it using Dvr Examiner. You could export out to a USB thumb drive as pictured here, or you could export out to your internal computer hard drive or another drive that you have available. And then finally, probably one of the most important parts, and I'm not going to go deep into the user interface here because I think Andrew's case study shows this off quite a bit better, is you get a consistent user interface. So you get an interface that looks like this. So no matter what DVR you're accessing, if we support it, you have the same interface to deal with it. And Andrew's going to be able to show you some of the highlights from the case that we're going to show today. And so you get a good feel for the user interface. But before I turn it back over to Andrew, I'd like to say that the reason why we decided to put this together is Andrew came to me and said that he had a case where he was able to use Dvr Examiner. And this was kind of a unique situation just because it was so many DVRs from disparate locations and disparate types of DVRs that he was able to tie all this back together using Dvr Examiner and iNPUT-ACE. And this tool is used all the time in different investigations, but sometimes you don't get the benefit of having that many DVRs from different locations that you can tie together like he was able to do. So I thought it was a really cool opportunity to show that off. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Andrew and let him show you kind of the workflow that he went through.
All right, thank you, Jimmy, for that introduction. So what we're going to do now for the rest of this presentation is focus on a particular case study using the interaction between Dvr Examiner and iNPUT-ACE to extract out the evidence in question, quickly find the suspect, and then build a report that we can then export out to PDF and comprehensively show the activity in question. Now, certainly this is a pared down example. The actual case has a few additional cameras involved, but we want to condense this down to show it in about a 45-minute time frame. So with that said, here's a quick Google Earth overview of the location. There is a homicide that occurs on camera in this particular parking lot, just off the distance of one of the cameras at the Double Eagle Bar. And the suspect is reported to have fled the scene traveling in this direction. Now, sometime later, investigators attended the scene and extracted DVRs from each of these 3 different locations from Google Earth. They also reported time offsets that exist from each of the cameras. So what we can see here is that the incident is purported to occur at 11:27 a.m. on November 28th, and each of the 3 different DVRs, starting with the Double Eagle Bar, which again here, if we go back over to the Google Earth image, is the location in question where the homicide occurred. And that offset of the DVR, and by offset I mean when the DVR was reporting the next day when the investigators seized the DVR, they reported that at 11:43:36 in the morning, the DVR was reporting that time, but the actual time on their cell phones was reporting 12:46:56. So we can see that there's an offset where the DVR is almost an hour behind real time. The other locations have a similar offset. The basketball court, which here is the middle location right here, that offset, if we look back at our sheet here, is just about a minute, or almost a minute later in time than what actual time is reporting. And that DVR was actually seized the following day. So this DVR here was seized the day after the homicide. These 2 were seized 2 days after the homicide. And now what we have are 3 different DVRs that I'm going to be using on my desk here and talking you through the process of plugging these into the system, using Dvr Examiner to extract them, sending those files into iNPUT-ACE to then continue the rest of the workflow. And here's what each of the DVRs look like once we've taken a screwdriver and simply unscrewed the top of the box. We can see a basic hard drive, and then the motherboard here with the cables that connect to the hard drive that have been unplugged. We have another DVR here with a smaller hard drive, but the concept is the same. There's a motherboard with cables that connect. And this is something that's consistent across basically every DVR that we'll find out in the real world, whether it's going to a 7-Eleven to extract data, or virtually anywhere else, you'll find many different DVRs that contain components that are more or less the same concept. It's a motherboard and a hard drive, some basic cabling, and some inputs and outputs. So these three DVRs are on my desk right now, and I'm going to be plugging into these different DVRs one at a time. First, by taking a write blocker and then plugging in the cables into this device, plugging that into my machine like we would see here. So I'll be talking through the process where I'm saying from the double eagle bar, I've now plugged in the hard drive, turning on the write blocker. And so just so that you can visualize what I'm doing on my desk as I talk through it, this is what my desk looks like currently in front of me. So without further ado, let's start that exact process. I'm going to load up Dvr Examiner. I'm going to plug in the hard drive from the double eagle bar, which is this one right here. And now by simply pressing detect, Dvr Examiner is going to go through and identify for us all of the different things that it can do. Now I'm going to go quickly through this process here, and I'll let anyone that's interested in further information about this go speak with Dvr Examiner to get additional details. But for now, all we're going to do is scan this drive. But I do want to change the date and time offset. It's something that was provided to us by the investigators. So if I go over to this document here and we see that the Dvr time is at the 29th at this time, and the actual time was this time here, what I'm going to do now is simply type those values in. So my Dvr time is 2016-11-29, so 2016-11-29. And the actual time of that when the image was taken, or rather when the DVR was pulled by the investigators, was 11:43:36. The actual date and time during that, according to the cell phone of the investigator, was the same date, but the time was 12:46:56. So when I press continue, Dvr Examiner is now going through and scanning for all the clips that it can find on that device. And you can see just how rapidly it's going through the device and identifying each of the clips in question that are available. Once this is done, I'm going to set an additional filter to filter down to the area of time that surrounds the homicide. So as it was reported, the homicide here occurs at 11:27. So what I'm going to do now is filter out some time that extends just around the area of the incident. So how about starting from 11:20 and then maybe going from 11:20 over to something like 11:35. That way we've got a 15-minute time period that we're scanning for. Then we can see every clip that it is that 15-minute period around the area of the homicide. And we can see each of the different cameras in question. There's 15 different cameras. But one piece of additional information that was provided to us is that channel 13 is the camera in question that is aiming in the direction of the homicide. So I'm only going to extract out those two cameras just to speed this process up a little bit. So when I come up here to export those selected clips, I now have some options about where to save the files. So I'm going to just set that to a folder here that I have that's called my DVR acquisition case workflow. And then I have two options here to choose the format of whether or not I want the native files in .264 or open files in AVI. Now, because I have iNPUT-ACE, I'm always going to prefer grabbing the native video files. I like getting the original files on the DVR, those original bytes without a container that might also include some additional metadata like date and timestamp. Now what I'm going to do here is check this checkbox that says send to iNPUT-ACE to automatically have those files get added to my iNPUT-ACE file list. Now, if I already have iNPUT-ACE launched, it's going to add those files here in the file list. If I don't already have iNPUT-ACE launched, it will automatically launch iNPUT-ACE for us. But now let's see what happens once I press that Start Export button. We can see Dvr Examiner going through and grabbing those two clips. And then once this second clip here is done exporting, we'll see a new folder pop in here with my two Camera 13 files that I can now interrogate, scrub through, and see the events. So since we know the DVR offset time, and we know that the events are supposed to occur at that 11:27, applying the offset, the suspect should be on camera around 11:23:50 something. So I can scrub through the timeline, and I can also zoom into the timeline here just a little bit further, just so that I can move forward in time and see if I can spot the suspect moving in the camera view. And I think here we go. If I zoom into my video and play forward here in real time, we can see what we believe might be the suspect here approaching the victim. The suspect then reaches for his waist. We can see the suspect extend his arm, and then the victim goes to the ground, and the suspect then runs off. So what I'm going to do now here, to jump ahead to what's going to be the rest of this workflow, is I'm going to keep track of marking a few important images. So the image right here, for example, where we see that suspect's arm extended, I'm going to mark that frame with my M key, and I'm going to make a little note here that this is going to be the homicide time. And then I can apply some narrative report text if I choose to describe this event. And I can say something like, at 10:23:58, on screen time, of course, the suspect is visible extending his arm toward the victim. And then thank you for spell check, which I frequently require. I'm going to save that marked image. So now anytime in the future that I want to come back to this marked image, I can easily snap back to that. And then the last thing I'm going to do here before I move on to the next DVR is scrub backwards in time to the moment when the suspect here is off the camera view. And I'm going to make a subclip that just marks the clip of time from the moment that we see the suspect on that camera. So how about starting from about right here, I'm going to mark my in with my I key. And I'm going to scrub through those events until we see the victim, or excuse me, this is suspect again here, run away off the camera view. I'm going to play forward this in real time. We see the suspect then flee the scene. I'm going to mark my out and then my S for my subclip. And I'll just call this my homicide clip. So I'm beginning to build markers and subclips surrounding the area of interest on this particular camera view. And the last thing I'll do here is change the name of my group, because the default here when files are sent from Dvr Examiner is imported files. I'm going to go ahead and change the name of that to the name of this location, which is the double eagle bar. Now I'm going to save my project up here by coming up to my project actions and saying save. We've had a preloaded name of that project before we started this webinar that we're now going to keep a track of, so that at any point in time in the future, we can reload the project and regain all of these clips. So now we are done with this particular DVR. So I'm going to go back here to my clip list and press New Source to return back to loading screen. I'm done with that clip. And if we look back now here to our Google Earth, we've now grabbed the event in question during the time of the homicide. We've seen the suspect enter the camera view, extend his arm towards the victim, and then flee the scene back in this direction. So sometime later, we're expecting that we'll see the suspect appear here on the basketball court. And if we're lucky, we'll also see him approaching the scene and then returning from the scene. So let's now move to that next DVR in question. So right now I'm going to unplug my USB and turn off the right blocker while I unplug the DVR from the double eagle bar. And I'm now plugging in the device from the basketball court. Okay, now that that's plugged in, I'm going to turn back on the right blocker. Once that's up and running, I'm going to plug that back into my computer. And now we're ready to begin looking at the DVR from this location in question right here. Now this particular format of DVR does take about 5 minutes to scan. The last one only was a few seconds. Now 5 minutes is still a very fast process considering how long it took in the old ways. But for the sake of this webinar, I'm actually going to load a saved case from within Dvr Examiner. Prior to this webinar, I've already scanned this device. So I'm simply going to reload that same saved case from within Dvr Examiner, just so that we can save about that 5 minutes of time that we had before. So I'm going to go browse that device here, that saved case here, which is the basketball court. I'm then going to load that saved case, select the new hard drive that I've plugged into my computer. By pressing load session, Dvr Examiner is now going to go through and not need to rescan the device, but instead already identify where all the clips are, just to save myself that 5 minutes. So now we're back again to the same thing we were doing on the last case, but now we're on the basketball court DVR location. So now I need to set my Dvr time offset and my actual time offset, which I've already done here in the saved project. So we can see that the Dvr offset has been set. And the next step that we want to do here is filter the time frame in question. So just like before, why don't we set a 15-minute period around the event in question, which was about 11:20 to 11:35 on the 28th. And now when I apply that filter, we can see all of the clips again in question. This time, however, what we've been told is that camera 1 is the image in question. But because there's a smaller number here, just for the sake of this webinar, I'm going to extract out all of the different clips just so we can look at the time frame that it would normally take to extract out a much larger number of files. Again, we're going to come up here to extract those selected clips. I'm going to choose my destination to be the same folder as last time so we can keep a running list of each of the exports from Dvr Examiner. This time we're provided with only the open AVI files as an option, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's an acceptable alternative. If there was a proprietary file format here, I would have chosen that instead. I'm going to send this to iNPUT-ACE. I'm going to provide a quick hash as my report, and then I can start that export. So again, in a few moments here, we're going to see a new group that will appear called imported files that's going to contain all of these different files that are currently being exported from Dvr Examiner. Some of them ranging in file size of about 250 meg, some of them being as small as about 2 megabytes, which is going to process much more quickly than some of the larger files will. But again, we can still see here that this is a significantly faster process than any other mechanism could be. Once this is done, I'm going to use that Dvr time offset to attempt to find the suspect approaching the scene on camera 1. I will then make another subclip and an image of that location just so we can continue marking and tracking that. And then ultimately, we're going to combine all of the evidence from each of the different locations into a narrative report, which is one of the brand new features of iNPUT-ACE version 2.0. Okay, so here's all of my files. I'm going to set the group name of this to something more logical than imported files, something like my basketball court. And now I can jump over to my camera 1 and begin to search for the suspect, which when applying the offset, he should be on scene somewhere around 11:28. So we can scrub forward to that time. 11:28 of the on-screen. Oh, and right there, we see an individual matching similar clothing. Let me zoom into my timeline just so I can scrub with a little bit more specificity. And then going back in time here, we can see that at 11:28 and 36 seconds here, we can see him running away from the location. So just going back to our map just to get our bearings again. We've already worked on the homicide location of the double eagle. Now what we're seeing is the suspect going in this direction away from the scene. So I think we need to go back a little bit further in time. How about a minute and a half or so to 11:26 something? I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here so we can scrub back in time more quickly. And then at roughly 11:26:35, here we see him now approaching the scene. So I'm going to move forward so we can get a good image of his clothing, and then let's mark that image so we can, again, continue to keep track of this. How about the image right about here? So I'm going to mark this. This is our basketball court camera. And I'll just call this my suspect image. With the narrative report text here, we can really say anything that we'd like about this image that is relevant. So here I'm just going to say something like suspect visible approaching at 11:26:41 on-screen time, which we know is offset from real time by a little bit. All right, now that we have that, let's go back in time here and make a quick clip of these events, again by marking an in with my I key, moving forward through the event when he's walking toward the homicide location, and then marking an O to make my out. I'm actually going to go back in time a little bit more to get a little bit tighter on my out mark, just by holding my arrow key, and I'll mark my out right about there. So this is now the basketball court approach. This time I'm not going to apply any narrative report text, just so we can see what that looks like when we're all done. And as we saw about 11:28, 30 something, we had seen him then running in the opposite direction from the homicide location. So I'm going to go back to that, and let's make a quick subclip just of these events of him running away from that scene. So going back in time here, I'll mark my in, I'll play forward through the events, and then we can mark my out once the individual is off camera here, make that subclip with the S key, and I'll call this basketball court departure. So typically in a full case, I probably want to spend a little more time playing through the area of question, but in this case, all I'm going to do is come up here and save my project, again, so that I can reload this data at any point in time in the future. And now what we have is we've seen the suspect walking in this direction. We've seen an individual that looks very similar to the suspect that we might want to do some comparisons on in the future, but just to make my speaking in language more easy during this webinar, I'm going to refer to them as being the same individual. So we see the suspect approaching the scene here. We see him on camera here. We see him then fleeing and fleeing. Now the question is, can we see him fleeing again here through the apartment complex? So let's go back now to Dvr Examiner. Let's go back to do a new source, return to that landing scene, and I'm going to do the same process here by unplugging my right blocker, turning it off, plugging in the final DVR, which is the apartment complex, turning everything back on, and then we'll do another scan, and we'll scan through the apartment complex DVR and see if we can find some additional clips in question. So here we have it. I'll run the detect on this, continue. We'll set our date and time offset, which if we go back to our provided PDF here, we can see that the date and time offset should be 2016-11:30. So 2016-11:30 at 13:05:07. The actual date and time, as reported by the investigators, is the same day, but 14:53:08. Once we run the scan of this, we'll see again quite quickly that all of the clips will come in. And now I can do my quick filtering here, just so that I can filter out and see only that roughly 15-minute duration in time surrounding the homicide time, which is about 11:20 to about 11:35. So once we've filtered out each of the clips in question, we could look and extract out each of these different angles. But again, just for time's sake here, it's been reported that camera 2 is the clip in question. And because the file size is about 450 meg, I'm only going to export that one selected clip. So again, same process here. We're going to export that one folder. I'm going to choose my native video files because there's an option for that here. I'm going to send to iNPUT-ACE, choose the MD5 hash, and start the export. I see a question that has come in asking about the AVI option versus the proprietary file option. And the question is, if only AVI is visible in the file, what exactly are we getting out? Is that the same as the raw evidence, or is that something different? And maybe we can double back to this to have Jimmy answer that more thoroughly at the end of the webinar. But I can at least tell you that the bits of data, the bytes of data that represent the individual frames are the same. It's simply a rewrapping process into an AVI container that's being provided by Dvr Examiner to ensure that the playback is possible outside of the DVR. So if you look back through one of our past webinars, one of the past months, we ran a webinar that was talking about the concept of lossless transcoding and what hexadecimal values are and how to confirm whether or not a file has been losslessly converted. So I recommend watching that webinar to go into further detail about that kind of process. And you can see all of those here on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and just simply type in iNPUT-ACE, the very first link here is our YouTube channel. And the webinar that I'm referring to is this converting video lossless transcoding option. All right, we can see that the menu popped up reporting that iNPUT-ACE has received the exported file from Dvr Examiner. So I'm going to go ahead now and interrogate that file. And let's go attempt to see the suspect leaving that homicide scene. So once we applied our offset, we should see him on the on-screen time roughly around 9:41. I'm going to spread forward to that time here. And let's just kind of play through that 9:41 period in time in a little bit more detail and see if we can see the individual still running down the side of this block. So I'm scrubbing through here. We can see some cars. I'm going to go back in time here. Let's see if we can see him more thoroughly. And there he is. So I can see him now running through that scene. So in this case, what I'm going to do here is, instead of marking an image, to speed this up to make sure that we can save some time for questions at the end of this, I'm going to make a subclip only of these events. So I'm holding my arrow key back to bring that backwards in time. I'll mark my in to my start of my in. I'm going to play through those events. Go back in time here a little bit, play through those events until he's off the camera view. Mark my out, make the subclip, and this particular camera is the apartment complex. Let's call this the departure. Now that I've got my subclip in question, my final subclip, I'm going to go ahead and save this project just to make sure that we have everything that we can again reload in the future. And essentially now I'm completed with Dvr Examiner. I can now close down the program. I've extracted all three of the different sequences and questions that I need. I've got my three groups here within iNPUT-ACE. I'm going to name this final one my apartment complex. And we can see each of the different clips in question from the basketball court, from the apartment complex, and from the double eagle bar, along with my marked images showing me the areas of it in question, so that any time in the future when writing the report, when I want to snap back to the homicide time, I can simply interrogate that marked image. It's going to reload the original clip. It's going to then allow me to, if I zoom out of here, let me interrogate these files real fast here. Looks like by closing down Dvr Examiner, it may have had an index that disappeared here. So I'm going to really quickly here just save this project. And I'm going to reload iNPUT-ACE here just to show you what it looks like when you reload a project. So if I come up here and say project actions load, and I browse to that project file and load it, what we'll see here is that it'll grab all of those different clips in question. It'll allow me to continue to then see what each of these different camera angles look like. By then doing something like interrogating my homicide time marked image, it will reload the homicide time at that marked frame. I can zoom in and I can again here see the suspect with his arm outstretched toward the victim's location. So let's move on now to the final concept that we want to cover here, which is the quick generation of a narrative report. Now I'm going to do this very quickly and not focus too heavily on what it can look like when a final report is done. But I've basically got here a simple title page pre-built. And I'm going to now begin to build a narrative report, including all these different evidence items, like the marked images and the subclips. But I'm also going to bring in my Google Earth image, just so that we can drag that Google Earth image in and use that within the report, so that we can identify the different locations and to help the reader understand what it is that we're talking about. So back on my narrative report, I'm going to come in here and create a heading at size 20. And I'm going to call this heading the approaching homicide scene. Let's go back down to normal size here at about font size 16. And I can bring in my Google Earth bitmap image. And you'll notice that by default within iNPUT-ACE, when you drag an item into the report, it will come in a reduced size. If we want to change that, we can come up to our Insert tab and select the default size, which will allow the image to come in at the full scale size of the original screenshot. Now here's a little trick that I like to do. I like to copy that image with Control-C and paste a new version of the image. Because this way what I can do is I can scale down my original image, and I can use my copied image and go inside of it and crop out the area in question. And we're going to start by the original approach, which is the suspect walking past that basketball court location. And when I resize this up, what we can do here now is draw a quick rectangle if we want to over the area that I've enlarged, and apply a little arrow extending from that location to here to show the reader that this location has been just blown up in size right here. Then what we can do is now drag in any items that we want where the suspect is approaching the scene. So we have this basketball court with the suspect approaching, which is that marked image. And when I drag that marked image in, here's the marked image in its full size, but you'll notice that it's a little bit large compared to the window. So that's why what I like to do is come over to my Insert tab and go back down to a smaller size. That way when I drag the item in, it will come in at a more logical size that we can use to then ensure that we can see what's being spoken about. And you'll notice that by default, when you drag an image in, a marked image, it will include the narrative report text that we applied earlier during this webinar. And I can even apply a little arrow here if that's going to help the reader understand who the suspect is as they're approaching the homicide location. Then if I want to, I can bring in the clip of the approach from that basketball court location. And the clip did not have any text associated with it, so there's no text right now. But if I want to, I can apply a quick text box and then type in manually whatever I'd like to. So for example, I could say something like suspect visible approaching homicide location. Okay, so maybe now I'm done with that particular heading. And now let's talk about the homicide scene itself. So I'm going to go back to make a new heading, jump this up to size 20, and I'll call this my homicide location. Oops, homicide location. So just like before now, I can bring in my marked image of the homicide. And you'll notice that by default, when you bring these in, you have an image with a text box that are grouped together. Now I can ungroup them very easily if I want to, but also by single clicking, I'm able to select an individual item in that group so I can move it to whatever location I want, and it will then still stay grouped with that item. So just like before, what I'm going to do is click this, and I can click a second time to copy that image and paste just the image in order to do something like going inside of that and cropping out the individual in question so we can see that in a little bit bigger detail and make that a little bit larger. So now what I've got here is a slightly more demonstrative way of showing what's occurring at the homicide location. And I can even draw a little arrow from my text box to that image, and also to my cropped and enlarged one if that makes it easier to see happening. Then if I wanted to group all these items together, I can simply click on them all using my control key and say group. And then that way, all of these items now are one group that can be moved around. One thing that I forgot to do was bring in my Google Earth image of this homicide location. So I'm going to move this down to my second page here and come back up and bring in my Google Earth image again. That way I can continue to talk about the homicide location. So one thing I forgot to do here is make that a default size, bring in that homicide location. I'm going to duplicate the image just like I did before, resize down the image so it fits on the page a little bit better. And then now what we're looking at here that we're caring about is this homicide location at the double eagle bar. So I can crop this. I know this is moving rather quickly, but I want to make sure that we save enough time for questions at the end of this webinar. Hopefully you can see how we can design these narrative PDF reports that help describe the events in question and provide better clarity to anyone who's reading through the report to understand what's occurring. Lastly, here at the homicide location, I'm going to add in a clip of my homicide. And I can even just make this a little bit larger if I want and just add a quick text box saying that this is a clip. So text box, drag this over, clip of events. Okay, what I like to do very frequently here is save this project. So I'm going to press my save key just to save all of these embedded items. And let's come down to our last heading, which is going to be the departing of the homicide location. And now we can do the very same thing we did before. And I'm going to just, for time's sake, skip the Google Earth views and just drag in each of the different items as the suspect. Oh, sorry about that. My phone just fell down. I'm going to grab some additional items here of just the suspect then leaving that homicide location. So we're going to start with the basketball court. And I can bring in these clips in full size if I choose to. And then we can even bring in the apartment complex being left as well. I'm going to make some additional lines here just so we have some space for this. And I'll leave my large full-scale images on the center of the page just like this. And bump down some additional lines. And now essentially what we have is a report describing the different events in question, with the suspect entering the homicide location, committing allegedly the homicide here on screen, leaving those events, departing the location through the different camera views. And again, if I spent a little bit more time to continue making the formatting the same as the beginning, we can make this look a little bit more in line with the first couple pages. But one thing that I'd like to do to end this is make one little demonstrative clip that shows all of those different sequences in chronological order. So for those of you familiar with iNPUT-ACE, if we toggle over to our workflow tab, we can do an advanced process called our canvas editor. And what the canvas editor allows us to do is take these different sequences and put them in order, starting with the basketball court with the approach, through the homicide, then to the basketball departure and the apartment complex departure. I can, oops, excuse me, click on the canvas editor. I meant to say concatenate. And what we can do now when we connect these files to concatenate is produce a clip that will play through each of these different sequences in real-time order, even though each of these different clips is a different frame rate and a different file size. It doesn't matter. iNPUT-ACE will still be able to concatenate those. And we can put them together into something like an MP4 file. I'm just going to call this my sequence of events. I'm going to check this checkbox to send those outputs to my file list. And what's going to happen now is it's going to process those 4 different clips into a single sequence that's going to appear back here in my file list. And I can then add that video directly to my report by going over to the narrative report and dragging in that sequence of events directly into the report. And you can see here, here's the clip in question. I'll just move this down to another page. So again, you can visualize how if we spent a little bit more time, we could more thoroughly flesh out and organize this report. But I'm going to stop here just to save enough time to save this one last time and then generate a PDF report that will embed all of the video and image content. And I'll just save this to my desktop. Name this my report.pdf. And what the iNPUT-ACE narrative report is doing now is taking all of those videos, all of the images, embedding them into a single PDF report. And that single PDF report can be sent to any other individual like a prosecutor or another investigator or a video lab so that they can then read through those exhibits and understand exactly what's occurring during that sequence of events. So here's the PDF. We can see that it's got a file size of about 53 megabytes. And if I launch this PDF report, here's my very simplistic title page. And of course, typically you would be using an agency's template title page to organize the first page of the report. And the subsequent pages are going to be organized in the same way as they are within iNPUT-ACE's narrative report. Each of the embedded images can be clicked on, and it's going to automatically open that here inside of the reader's native window photo viewer. And this is the uncompressed bitmap image of this particular event. So now the prosecutor can zoom in, can see this in any detail that they'd like. And we can do that consistently throughout each of the images, including the Google Earth images. We can open these up and, oops, excuse me, that's a video link here, but we can click on the video links like this one here, and it will open up and play the video link inside of whatever is playing back MP4 files. And we can watch now in real-time speed the suspect approaching the homicide location, understanding where that came from the Google Earth, see where the homicide is here on our Google Earth image, click on any image like the homicide image here and zoom in and see the event in greater detail. Click on the video clip to watch the clip of the events as the suspect begins to approach the victim and extend his arm. And this is a great way of providing clarity to complicated video evidence in a way that can be presented to a trier of fact or to an attorney in a very simple way. Now, of course, when doing things to a trier of fact, we might simplify this even further just to help organize the exhibits, but to highlight the different ways that this narrative report can be used. Many people are using it for creating simple and effective BOLO reports or narrative analysis, tracking a suspect through the different scenes. And this sequence of events here that we have, we can click on and play, and it just played off screen here. Let me open that up. For some reason, the VLC is trying to launch off my window. Give me 1 second here while I get that open. See if I can maximize that. Oh, we can see it playing off screen. I'm not quite sure why that's playing out of the available window for the webinar here. Let me try that one more time. VLC is not playing nice today. Well, we can see that it's playing. It's just offside of my window, and I can't drag that in. So hopefully this provides a thorough enough overview of how the iNPUT-ACE narrative report is used in investigations to create exhibits that can be helpful for prosecutors, helpful for trier of facts, and helpful for anyone else who wants to identify and clarify what's happening on video exhibits. So here's the clip in question. Again, I'm not sure why that was playing off my window, but it's fixed now here. And we can see that concatenating those clips together, even though the file dimensions were different, is as simple as connecting those 4 clips together into a concatenate node and connecting those out to an MP4 file, and then we're basically done. If we were to spend a little bit more time on something like this, what I'll do here while we begin questions is load a more thorough report of another case where there's significantly more exhibits in question and a larger number of pages that I'd help identify some more complicated exhibits that the report is helpful in clarifying for us. So that all said, please don't hesitate to ask questions during this final phase of the report or this presentation. I'm going to load another report from a different case just to show an example of another method for providing these types of narratives. But during that time, please do not hesitate to begin asking questions, and we'll address those while this project begins to load.
Andrew, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and answer a couple of the questions that came in while you're doing that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
All right. One was a question that we had earlier regarding only the AVI files versus the native files, and you covered a little bit of that. One thing I just wanted to touch on is that when you are presented with that option between AVI versus native or one or the other, there's no difference in the data that's listed in the clip list. It's just a matter of how that data is put out. So if we found 100 clips, those are the 100 clips that are on the DVR. It's just a matter of how we're able to export that out. And sometimes that's a limitation of the DVR. Maybe the native file is AVI, for example. I don't remember in this particular case, but that's just a limitation of output. It's not a limitation of what you're actually recovering. So there's no additional data there to be recovered. The other question that someone submitted was regarding using forensic images rather than the DVR hard drives themselves, and having more success with forensic images. It all comes down to your workflow. Internally within Dvr Examiner, there's no difference whatsoever between a forensic image and a hard drive of that same data. So as long as those are the same exact data, it would process the same. The only difference is speed. If you make a forensic image, we'll often be able to process that faster, but you do have the overhead of creating that forensic image, and that does take some time. But if you're going to be accessing a lot of data, it's often better to make a forensic image and invest that time in advance because it will be faster. You got to think some of these DVR hard drives are relatively slow, and they're not going to be the best thing to recover, say, 2 terabytes of data directly off of. In Andrew's example here, he only needed a very small amount of video, so there's really nothing wrong with just right blocking it and going straight from the hard drive in that scenario. A lot of people do that out in the field where they don't want to take the time to make a forensic image and they're not likely to come back to recover more video, for example. But in the case of like a homicide where you weren't going to be able to keep the video or keep the hard drive, you would probably want to make a forensic image in that case.
Thanks, Jimmy. I did see another person ask a question about the exports from Dvr Examiner and if those are only going into iNPUT-ACE in memory or if they're actually going to a folder as well. And they are going to a folder. I was directing them to a folder on my desktop. And we can see each of those 3 different jobs here with the folder in question, a HTML report, and then the video files that were extracted during that time. So if I open up that HTML report, we can see what Dvr Examiner is providing to us, so that we can then validate if we needed to these kinds of things inside of iNPUT-ACE. So some of the reports I had checked the MD5 hash checkbox in order to get the MD5 hash of those events. So like this one right here, for example, we can see the MD5 hash that we can then use to validate the hash of that file inside of iNPUT-ACE if we needed to go down that path at all. So all of this is going to correlate directly with what we're seeing inside of iNPUT-ACE. I have another question about the templates on the narrative report tab. Something that we're adding in the future is a much more thorough and simple way of adding templates, so that you can have a template for your BOLOs and a template for your narrative reports and any other number of templates that you might have. That's something that's in the pipeline within the iNPUT-ACE's development. But today you can simply use any of your Word document report templates and just copy and paste that content over from there into the narrative report. In the future, we'll be adding additional content for that. All right, so I know that we've run a little bit long on this particular webinar, so I'm going to end this now because we're just ending over an hour. I really appreciate everyone for attending this latest video evidence training webinar, and I would appreciate it if you answer the survey following this webinar. That does help us know what types of topics are helpful for you to continue moving forward with these. I look forward to seeing you next month, and thank you everyone again for participating. I hope you have a great day.